could freeze to death in a castle while guarding the king. We are used to thinking of medieval castles as impregnable fortresses or fairy tale palaces full of knights and beautiful ladies. But behind the romantic facade lay a harsh reality, especially when a long, cold winter descended upon the land. The stone walls that protected against arrows and siege weapons turned into an icy trap, and the most dangerous battle was not against the enemy, but against the piercing cold during endless night shifts. This is a story about those whose names did not make it into the chronicles, about the simple guards on the castle walls. Their enemy was not a foreign invader, but the frost, the darkness, and the sleep that overcame their tired bodies. Their armor was not plate, but layers of coarse wool, and their main task was not to perform a feat, but simply to live to see the dawn. In this video, we will immerse ourselves in the icy world of a medieval fortress on a winter night. We will learn what the amenities in the castle really were and why the safest job, at first glance, could turn out to be deadly. Watch the video to the end, and you will learn how the guards waged their invisible war against the cold and what simple but ingenious tricks helped them avoid turning into ice statues on duty. I will reveal the most closely guarded secret of the stone walls of medieval fortresses, and it is not secret passages or hidden treasures. The first and most insidious enemy of the night guard was not the frost itself, but the devastating effect it had on his mind and ability to think clearly. The cold mercilessly slows down not only the body's physical reactions, but also the speed of thought processes, dulling attention and turning vital alertness into dangerous apathy and indifference. The unbearable monotony of a long night watch on a high wall was greatly exacerbated by this depressed state of mind. Hour after hour, minute after minute, the guards saw only the same dark stone wall or the monotonous snow-covered empty courtyard below, without any change. The only sounds breaking the dead silence were the monotonous howling of the icy wind in the battlements and the periodic creaking of his own freezing leather equipment and metal armor, which gradually drove the man mad with monotony. In such extreme conditions of isolation and cold, the human mind inevitably begins to play evil and dangerous tricks on its owner. In the howling of the night wind, the tormented consciousness begins to hear human voices, cries for help, or the threatening whispers of enemies. And ordinary shadows on the snow, cast by the moon or a torch, turn into sinister moving figures of enemy scouts or entire detachments. It became almost impossible even for experienced warriors to distinguish real threats from hallucinations generated by their freezing and exhausted minds. It was a real cruel psychological torture, painfully stretched out over the endless hours of the night. They had to fight not only the overwhelming physical desire to sleep and warm up, but also the slowly creeping paranoia and irrational fear. Every unexpected rustle in the darkness could mean either an enemy scout or saboteur sneaking up on them, or simply harmless snow falling from the tower roof, or a rat running between the stones.
Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed.
Maintaining clarity of mind and the ability to adequately assess what was happening was absolutely essential for survival. The guards constantly whispered to each other if they were on double duty and had a comrade in misfortune nearby, or muttered something monotonously under their breath and read prayers if they were standing alone. Any mental activity, even the most primitive, helped them resist the dangerous icy numbness of the mind and maintain a connection with reality. They mentally listed their numerous duties point by point, recalled in detail the events of the past day or week, conversations with comrades, or simply methodically counted the visible stars in the night sky.
Hold the line.
All this was absolutely necessary to keep the freezing brain functioning and prevent it from shutting down. A complete cessation of active thought and immersion in oblivion meant inevitable defeat in this battle with the cold and possible death from hypothermia. Constant physical activity also critically helped to dispel the dangerous mental fog and numbness of consciousness. The guards moved constantly, never standing still for a minute. They methodically walked from one end of the long wall to the other and back, stamped their feet energetically on the stone floor, vigorously rubbed their numb, frozen fingers and toes, and waved their arms. This constant movement stimulated blood circulation throughout the body and prevented consciousness from completely fading under the influence of the cold. The most frightening psychological test was the oppressive feeling of complete isolation from all living and human beings. On a high, lonely tower, far from the warm, twinkling lights and noisy warmth of the common room with his comrades, the guard was alone with the merciless elements and his anxious thoughts. This oppressive feeling of abandonment and loneliness weighed on his unstable psyche no less, and sometimes even more, than the physical cold that penetrated to his bones. For many hardened warriors, this exhausting night watch on the walls of the fortress became a kind of harsh meditation on survival and overcoming their own weaknesses. They gradually learned to control not only their freezing bodies and their need for warmth and rest, but also their wandering thoughts, irrational fears, and the creeping panic in the face of darkness and uncertainty. Only in this way, through strict internal discipline and willpower, could they endure the long shift to the end and greet the long-awaited dawn alive and sane. Modern night work in a warm office with a coffee machine may seem tedious and monotonous, but it can hardly be compared in intensity to this icy test of body and spirit. We are very interested in hearing your point of view. What do you think about how such extreme conditions affected the psychological resilience of people in the past? Write about it in the comments. Want to know the main secret to a guard's survival in the cold? It lies not in shiny armor or sharp swords, but in what was underneath them, the right clothing. Metal armor in severe cold was deadly dangerous for the wearer, as it instantly cooled to the temperature of the surrounding air and mercilessly took away precious heat from the body through direct contact. Therefore, the basis of an experienced guard's winter uniform was a well-thought-out, multi-layered clothing system that created air pockets. The first layer, worn directly on the naked body, was long underwear made of coarse linen, covering the torso and limbs. It effectively absorbs sweat produced during movement, preventing the body from becoming hypothermic from its own moisture, which turned into an icy crust. It was a simple but critically important element of protection from the cold that many underestimated. Over the linen underwear, a thick, coarse shirt and long pants made of natural wool, often sheep's wool, were worn. Unlike cotton or linen, wool retains its insulating properties even when wet due to the special structure of its fibers. It was this unique property that made it an indispensable material for clothing in the harsh Middle Ages, especially in northern regions. The next important layer was the gambeson, a thick quilted jacket tightly stuffed with horsehair, tow, or simply old rags between layers of fabric. Originally designed to absorb sword blows under metal armor, in winter it became the main insulator for the entire outfit. Its thickness could reach 3 to 5 centimeters, depending on the warrior's wealth. On top of the voluminous gambeson, another thick woolen or cloth garment was worn, often with a deep hood to protect the head. It was important to reliably protect the neck and head, through which up to 40% of body heat escapes. A hood lined with warm fox or rabbit fur was a real luxury and a clear sign of the commander's care for his guards. Footwear was a separate and very important issue for guards standing on cold stone. Soldiers wore high leather boots or sturdy shoes, but they specifically chose them several sizes larger than usual. This allowed them to wrap several thick layers of fabric around their feet in the form of foot cloths and create a heat-insulating air layer to keep their feet warm. For additional insulation from the cold stone, dry grass, soft moss, or ordinary straw was placed in the shoes in a layer about a finger thick. These simple natural materials absorb moisture from the feet well and help to keep the feet relatively warm even during prolonged standing. Each shift, These improvised insoles had to be shaken out and replaced with fresh, dry ones. Hands were protected from frostbite by thick, warm mittens, often made of durable leather with fur inside. However, it was extremely uncomfortable to hold weapons and perform precise actions in them. Therefore, mittens often had a special slit or a flap that could be folded back so that, if necessary, the fingers could be quickly freed to grasp a sword or spear. This multi-layered survival suit was completed by a heavy, long woolen or warm sheepskin cloak that reached down to the calves. It provided reliable protection from the biting wind and wet snow, creating another important layer of still air around the entire body. Such a sturdy cloak was a real mobile shelter in which one could completely wrap oneself at a critical moment. But even the warmest clothes could not generate heat on their own. They only retained what the body produced. If a guard stopped moving and his metabolism slowed down, he was doomed to slowly freeze to death, even in thick clothing. But what if I told you that the very architecture of the castle, designed specifically to provide effective protection against external enemies, became the main unwitting ally of the cold? In the next chapter, you will learn why the massive stone walls were not a warm fortress, but a giant stone refrigerator. What if I told you that everything you believed about majestic castles was untrue? We imagine castles with huge fireplaces, but we overlook the most important detail: the material they are built from. Stone has high thermal conductivity, which means that it does not retain heat but actively draws it away. In winter, massive stone walls froze through. They acted as giant cold accumulators, constantly radiating icy chill into the rooms. Touching such a wall with an unprotected hand could be extremely unpleasant. The windows in modern castles are the result of later renovations. In the Middle Ages, windows were either small or non-existent, and to protect against precipitation, they were covered with oiled parchment or ox bladders. These materials let in a little light but provided almost no protection from the cold. Narrow slit windows were more common. They were necessary for defense, allowing archers to fire at the enemy. But in winter, these same slit windows turned into wind tunnels, through which icy winds blew into the castle. Even if there was a fireplace in the room, its heat only reached a few meters around it. 10 steps away from the fire, the temperature could be almost the same as outside. Constant drafts swept through the huge halls and corridors, negating all efforts to heat the building. To combat this in some way, the walls were hung with heavy tapestries and carpets. These fabrics created an air layer, slightly reducing heat loss. But this was only available in the Lord's chambers, not in the guard towers. The floors in castles were made of stone or earth. They were covered with a thick layer of straw or dry grass. This was done not only for warmth, but also for hygiene. The top layer was periodically removed along with the debris. Wooden elements, such as doors and shutters, were made of thick, poorly fitted boards. Huge gaps were common. Wind and snow penetrated inside, forcing the inhabitants to constantly wrap themselves in furs and blankets. The towers, where guards most often stood duty, were the coldest places in the castle. They were exposed to all the winds, and their sole function was defense, not comfort. Staying there for hours was a real test of endurance. Thus, the castle was not a cozy home, but a cold and drafty machine for war. Its architecture was subordinated to only one purpose: defense. And this defense required its inhabitants, especially the guards, to sacrifice their health and comfort on a daily basis. This is what happens behind the castle's massive closed doors when the harsh winter with its frosts and blizzards arrives. The main and practically only source of heat in the cold stone castle was open fire in its various forms: fireplaces, hearths, and braziers. However, its use was fraught with a host of serious problems, limitations, and dangers, making it more a symbol of desperate survival than a real source of comfort and coziness for the inhabitants of the fortress. In the large ceremonial halls and living quarters of the nobility and castle owners, massive stone fireplaces of impressive size with wide portals were installed. but their design was extremely inefficient in terms of actual heat transfer and room heating. Most of the precious heat from the burning wood, along with the smoke and hot air, escaped straight into the wide chimney, rising into the sky without really warming the cold room with its high ceilings. The efficiency of such a medieval fireplace was negligible. Only about 10 to 15% of the energy from the burning fuel actually went to heating. It provided pleasant, tangible warmth only to the few lucky ones who sat directly in front of the open dancing flames within a narrow radius of 2 to 3 meters from the fire. The rest of the huge, high-ceilinged room with thick stone walls and vaulted ceilings remained icy, damp, and drafty, with numerous drafts coming in through cracks and loopholes. In simpler rooms, including guard rooms for guards and cramped barracks for ordinary soldiers, primitive open hearths without chimneys were used, located right in the center of the hall on the stone floor or on a special platform. With this method of heating, the smoke escaped through a special opening in the wooden or stone roof, which was often not large enough to provide good draft. Such rooms were constantly filled with acrid gray smoke hanging under the ceiling, which caused serious, chronic breathing problems, constant coughing, and severe irritation of the eyes for all the inhabitants of these rooms. To heat remote posts on walls or in isolated cold towers, portable metal braziers on legs were sometimes used when fuel supplies allowed. These were forged iron baskets or copper bowls on 3 or 4 stable legs, filled with red-hot smoldering coals brought from the main hearth in the main hall. They provided a little local heat in a narrow radius of about a meter around themselves, but were extremely dangerous in everyday use during long shifts. Firstly, it was easy to accidentally set fire to one's multi-layered clothing, woolen cloak, or fur mittens with a careless movement in the dark or when tired. Second, even more dangerous, smoldering coals without an open flame emitted invisible, odorless, and deadly carbon monoxide gas. In the small, poorly ventilated, enclosed space of a watchtower with narrow loopholes, this could quickly lead to severe poisoning, loss of consciousness, and the agonizing death of a guard who simply fell asleep and did not wake up. Firewood for voracious fireplaces and charcoal for braziers were valuable and limited resources for any castle, especially in places far from forests. Their procurement required enormous labor, the time of many people, and the organization of special expeditions to the forest, and the stockpile accumulated since autumn for the long winter was strategically important for the survival of the entire garrison and the inhabitants of the castle. Spending it on constant round-the-clock heating of all guard posts on the long walls was considered an unaffordable luxury that even a wealthy owner could not afford. Therefore, most often, ordinary guards on open, drafty walls were completely deprived of any source of warming fire during their watch. They could only count on the heat of their own bodies, generated by movement and metabolism, and on the thermal insulation properties of their multi-layered woolen clothing and thick cloaks. The only real opportunity to warm up a little and thaw their frozen limbs was to quickly run to the guard room with its hot stove during the short break between long hours of duty in the cold. The fire provided the cold-weary guards not only with vital warmth for their bodies, but also with precious light, which was no less important and valuable during the dark, endless winter nights for performing their duties and observing the surroundings. However, even here, everything was far from as simple, convenient, and safe as it might seem at first glance to a modern person. In the next chapter, you will learn how medieval guards fought against the main invisible ally of the cold and enemy, the impenetrable winter darkness that enveloped the castle. Winter nights in the Middle Ages were not just dark, they were pitch black. Without street lighting and bright city lights, the only sources of light were the moon and stars, if they were not hidden by clouds. For a guard on the wall, this meant working in conditions of almost zero visibility. Imagine a world without electricity, streetlights, or even simple kerosene lamps. When the sun set below the horizon, darkness fell that is difficult for modern people to even imagine. This darkness was thick, dense, almost tangible. It enveloped everything around, turning familiar daytime objects into strange, frightening silhouettes. In such darkness, people lost their usual landmarks, and even their own fortress could seem alien and hostile. Torches were the main source of artificial light. They were made from sticks wrapped in tow or rags and soaked in resin or fat. Torches gave off a bright but very smoky and unstable light. Making torches was an art in itself. It was necessary to find suitable wood that was strong enough to support the weight of the combustible material, but not too resinous. Otherwise, the torch would burn too quickly and unevenly. The wick was soaked in animal fat or resin for several hours to ensure it was well saturated. A high-quality torch could burn for about an hour, but more often it lasted only 30 minutes. The flame was restless and flickering, casting long, dancing shadows that could deceive the eye and make one see an enemy where there was none. Using torches on the walls was dangerous. First, they exposed the guard's position, making him an excellent target for enemy archers. Second, a strong gust of wind could knock the torch out of his hand and cause a fire. Experienced warriors knew many stories of fortresses that fell not from assault, but from accidental fires. Wooden structures inside stone walls, thatched roofs, hay and grain stores, all this turned any fortress into a potential fire trap. In winter, when everything was dry from the frost, the danger of fire became even greater. In addition, the bright light of the torch not only revealed the guard's position, but also made it impossible to observe the darkness around him. Eyes accustomed to the bright flame simply could not distinguish anything outside the circle of light. Oil lamps and lanterns were a safer alternative. A lantern was a candle or lamp placed in a casing with walls made of thin horn or oiled paper. It provided a more even light that was protected from the wind. Such lanterns were a real achievement of medieval technology. The horn used for them was usually taken from a bull or sheep, soaked for a long time, then steamed and split into thin plates. These plates became almost transparent while remaining strong enough to protect the flame from the wind. Oil-soaked paper was cheaper but less durable and easily torn. Inside such a lantern, a small oil lamp with a wick made of twisted fabric was placed. Vegetable oil or animal fat was used, which gave a steady, albeit dim flame when burned. However, the light from the lantern was very dim. It allowed you to see only a few steps around you. It was impossible to illuminate a large area at the foot of the wall with it. This weak, yellowish light barely penetrated the horn walls and created a tiny island of visibility around the guard in an ocean of darkness. Beyond this circle, everything was lost in impenetrable blackness. Such a lantern was useful only for avoiding tripping on the narrow section of the wall or reading the password on a note. It was practically useless for observing the surroundings. A guard with a lantern could see his own hands and feet, but could not see what was happening even 10 steps away from him. The most expensive source of light was wax candles, but they were only available to the nobility and the church. Ordinary guards used cheaper and more unpleasant tallow candles. They were made from animal fat, smoked heavily, and emitted an unpleasant odor. Beeswax was rare and very expensive. Its production required time and effort from beekeepers, and the amount of wax that could be obtained was limited. Therefore, wax candles burned in churches during services and illuminated the chambers of lords and kings, but they were inaccessible to ordinary soldiers. Tallow candles were made from melted sheep, beef, or pork fat. The process of making them was simple, but the result left much to be desired. Such a candle gave an uneven, flickering light, constantly smoked, leaving black marks on everything around it. And the smell of burnt fat was so unpleasant that many preferred to do without light altogether. Often the guards did not carry any light sources at all. It was believed that eyes accustomed to darkness were better at distinguishing movement and silhouettes. The bright light from a torch or lantern could blind them for several minutes, which was unacceptable. This was not just folk wisdom, but centuries of proven experience. The human eye has an amazing ability to adapt to darkness, but it takes time to fully adapt, sometimes up to half an hour. If a guard stood in the dark long enough, his pupils dilated as much as possible, and he began to distinguish shades of darkness and see the vague outlines of objects in the dim light of the stars. But as soon as he looked at the bright flame of a torch, all this adaptation instantly disappeared. Eyes blinded by light could no longer see anything in the dark. That is why experienced guards avoided looking at the fire and preferred to work in complete darkness, relying on their other senses. Therefore, the guards learned to navigate in the dark, relying on their hearing and memory. They knew every stone on their section of the wall, every bend in the parapet. Their ears caught the slightest unusual sound, the crunch of snow, the clang of metal. The night shift was a kind of survival school. Young warriors were initially afraid of the dark, but gradually learned to distinguish between sounds and trust their senses. They memorized where there were irregularities in the wall, where a stone protruded slightly more than usual, where the parapet had a chip. This mental map allowed them to move confidently even in complete darkness. Hearing became the most important tool. A guard could tell by the sound of footsteps whether it was one of their own or an intruder. They could distinguish the sound of the wind in the trees, the crunch of snow under an animal's feet, the creaking of a rope on a siege tower. Any sound that did not fit into the usual pattern of the night immediately attracted attention. Darkness was both an enemy and an ally. It concealed potential threats, but it also concealed the guard himself. The main thing was to learn how to use it to one's advantage. A skilled warrior understood that darkness could work for him. A motionless guard in dark clothing against the backdrop of a stone wall was practically invisible. He could observe without being seen, hear the conversations of enemies creeping up to the wall, and catch the enemy off guard. In the darkness, the advantage went to those who knew the terrain better, who knew how to move silently, who could control their fear. Many military tricks of the Middle Ages were based precisely on the skillful use of darkness and surprise. Working in such conditions required maximum concentration. The guard had to constantly listen and peer into the night mist. It was a tremendous strain on the nerves, exacerbated by the cold and fatigue. A person cannot remain in a state of extreme alertness for long. The body gets tired, attention wanders, and hallucinations begin to appear. In the darkness, the imagination conjures up frightening images. Every sound seems ominous, every shadow an enemy. Added to this was physical discomfort. The frost penetrated to the bones. Fingers became so numb that it was impossible to hold a weapon, and fatigue weighed heavily. The guard fought not only against external threats, but also against his own body, which demanded rest and warmth. That is why shifts on the walls were relatively short, usually 2 to 3 hours, after which the warrior was replaced by another, fresher comrade. Ready for the shocking truth about the medieval diet? Food for a guard was not just a way to satisfy hunger, but a strategic resource in the fight against the cold. The right diet allowed the body to produce enough energy to withstand the frost. The basis of their diet was hot and very high-calorie food. The main dish was often potage, a thick soup or stew. It was cooked in large cauldrons on the main hearth in the castle. Potage contained everything that was available: grain, beans, vegetables, and, if lucky, a little meat or lard. The main thing was to make the dish as thick and fatty as possible. Fat provided the necessary energy for warmth. Hot soup was carried to the posts in special containers so that it would not have time to cool down. A sip of hot, hearty soup in the middle of a freezing night was a real salvation. It warmed you from the inside and gave you the strength to hold out until the end of your shift. Bread was another important part of the diet. It was coarse, made from low-quality flour, but very filling. It was dipped in soup or eaten with cheese and lard. The guards were given ale or beer to drink. These drinks were high in calories and safer than water, which was often contaminated. In the cold season, ale could be heated and spices added to it. In some castles, guards were given a portion of hot wine with spices, known as hippocras. Spices such as cinnamon and cloves were considered warming. However, alcohol had to be consumed with caution. It created a false sense of warmth, but in fact accelerated hypothermia. Meal times were not only physical but also moral support. They were a short break in the monotonous duty, an opportunity to feel warmth and taste. It was a reminder of the normal life that awaited below, in the warmth of the barracks. The process of changing the guard and delivering food was clearly organized. Not only the security of the castle depended on it, but also the lives of the guards themselves. But how exactly was this deadly routine organized? In the next chapter, we will analyze the night shift on the wall of a medieval castle, minute by minute. The night guard duty was subject to a strict and unchanging routine. Chaos and improvisation were unacceptable, as the safety of the entire castle depended on the precision of their actions. Each guard knew his maneuvers and his duties. The changing of the guard took place at a strictly defined time, which was measured by the stars or with the help of an hourglass. The procedure was quick and quiet. The old guard passed on all information about events during their shift to the new guard. Each section of the wall or tower was a separate post. Guards could not leave their post without orders or a valid reason. Movement around the castle at night was strictly limited. To maintain vigilance and confirm that everyone was at their posts and awake, there was a roll call system. The guard commander or his assistant periodically made the rounds. Guards at neighboring posts could also call out to each other using code signals. The signal could be a quiet whistle, the tapping of a spear shaft on stones, or a specific phrase. The response had to be immediate. No response was a signal of alarm and meant that something had happened to the guard on duty. Particular attention was paid to key points: the gates, the drawbridge, and the secret entrances. The posts here were reinforced, and the requirements for the guards were higher. It was through these points that the enemy could try to penetrate the castle. Falling asleep on duty was considered one of the most serious military crimes. It was punishable by severe punishment. Therefore, fighting sleep was as important a task as fighting the cold. The guards were constantly on the move within their posts. They walked back and forth and did simple exercises. Monotonous standing in one place inevitably led to falling asleep. The routine was exhausting, but it also saved them. The strict schedule did not allow them to relax and give in to weakness. Every hour marked by a change of guard or roll call was a small victory over the night. This system had been refined over centuries. It was written not in ink, but in the blood of those who paid with their lives for a moment of weakness. Discipline was the basis of survival. Despite their isolation at their posts, the guards were not alone. They were part of a small, closed community united by common danger and deprivation. This bond, forged in the cold nights, was often stronger than family ties. If the post was paired, a lot depended on the relationship with your partner. You had to completely trust the person standing next to you. Your life depended on their vigilance. During the long hours on duty, partners talked to keep themselves awake. They told each other stories from their lives, shared jokes, and discussed plans for the future. This helped pass the time and strengthen their bonds of friendship. There was an unspoken system of mutual assistance among the guards. If someone fell ill or was simply very tired, their comrades tried to replace or cover for them. They understood that today you help him, and tomorrow he will help you. Newcomers went through a tough training period. Experienced guards taught them all the tricks of the trade: how to dress properly, how to move without making noise, how to identify danger by sounds. This knowledge was not written down in the regulations. It was passed on by word of mouth. The communal meal in the guard room was an important social ritual. Over a pot of hot soup, they discussed the latest news, rumors, and simply the events of the day. It was a time of unity and brief rest. Humor, often dark and understandable only to them, was another way to cope with stress. They joked about their hardships, their superiors, and their enemies. Laughter helped them keep their spirits up in the most difficult conditions. However, there was also a hierarchy within this community. The word of the guard commander was law. Experienced veterans were universally respected, while slackers and cowards were treated with contempt. This brotherhood of cold was a source of support for everyone. Knowing that you were not alone, that there were people nearby going through the same trials, gave you strength. They warmed each other not only with the heat of their bodies in the cramped guardhouse, but also with the warmth of camaraderie. It was this unity that often became the deciding factor. The castle was defended not just by mercenaries, but by a single organism where everyone was ready to come to the aid of another. And the enemy, having decided to storm the castle, had to deal not with individual soldiers, but with this monolithic force. In addition to the obvious threat of freezing, the night shift held many other, less obvious dangers. Each of them could be fatal to an inattentive or careless guard. Neglecting them was tantamount to suicide. One of the main dangers was falling. The battlements on the walls and the stairs in the towers were covered with ice in winter. In the dark, wearing heavy clothing that restricted movement, one wrong move could lead to a fall from a great height. Weapons in the cold also became a source of danger. The metal parts of spears, halberds, or swords became icy. Touching them with bare hands could lead to frostbite. As already mentioned, carbon monoxide from braziers was a silent killer. A guard who decided to warm up in a closed room could simply fall asleep and not wake up. Therefore, ventilation was vital. Prolonged exposure to the cold led to frostbite. Most often, the fingers, toes, nose, and ears were affected. Loss of sensitivity in the fingers could prevent a guard from grabbing his weapon in time. Psychological exhaustion from constant stress, cold, and lack of sleep slowed reactions. A tired guard might simply fail to notice a threat that he would have recognized instantly under normal circumstances. Therefore, regular rest was not a luxury, but a necessity. Illness was a constant companion of the garrison. Colds, pneumonia, and other ailments caused by hypothermia were commonplace. In the absence of effective medicine, any of these diseases could be fatal. Another danger was the clothing itself. A long cloak could catch on a protrusion on the wall, causing a fall. Heavy and cumbersome clothing made the guards slow and vulnerable in the event of a sudden attack. A sudden snowfall or blizzard could completely disorient a guard. Visibility dropped to zero, and the howling wind drowned out all other sounds. In such weather, the garrison was practically blind and deaf. Every night was a comprehensive test of survival. The guard had to take into account dozens of factors, any of which could cost him his life. It was a job for the most resilient and disciplined. In the struggle for life and health, all means were good. Over the years of service, the guards accumulated many small but very effective techniques that helped them survive the most severe frosts. These life hacks were not taught in training, they were born out of harsh experience. One of the main rules was to never stand still. Constant movement was the key to survival. Even simply shifting from foot to foot or walking in circles got the blood flowing and kept the body from cooling down. The guards looked for any natural shelter from the wind. They tried to stand behind the battlements, in niches, or near the projections of the towers. The ability to find the quietest place on a wall exposed to all winds was a valuable skill. Fat was used to protect the face from frostbite. Thick animal fat or lard was rubbed on the cheeks, nose, and chin. This created a protective film that shielded the skin from the icy wind. To warm their hands, the guards kept stones heated on the fire in their pockets or mittens. The stones slowly gave off heat, allowing them to periodically warm their frozen fingers. The main thing was not to burn yourself. Some carried a small bag of salt or sand with them. Rubbing their hands with salt stimulated blood flow and created a feeling of warmth. It was a kind of chemical heating. It was very important to keep the body dry. If clothes got wet from sweat or snow, they tried to dry them as quickly as possible. Wet clothes in the cold are a direct path to hypothermia. It was also necessary to breathe correctly in the cold. Deep breaths of icy air could damage the lungs. Therefore, people breathed through a scarf or simply covered their mouths with mittens to warm the air they breathed in a little. Psychological attitude played a huge role. The guards tried not to think about how many hours were left until the end of their shift. They broke their duty into short intervals, setting themselves small tasks which helped time pass more quickly. All these seemingly minor details together created an effective survival system. It was the result of the collective experience of many generations of guards. It was these tricks that allowed them to do their duty and meet the dawn alive. We have accompanied a medieval guard through a long and cold night shift. We have seen that behind the stone walls of castles lay not a fairy tale, but a daily exhausting struggle for survival. Cold, darkness, fatigue, and fear were their constant companions. This story is a reminder of the price that was paid for security in the past. While lords and ladies slept in their chambers by the fireplaces, an invisible battle was unfolding on the walls, where ordinary people, whose names have been lost to history, showed miracles of fortitude and endurance. Their feat was not to slay a dragon, but simply to stay awake and not freeze to death. Modern technology has made our lives incomparably more comfortable and safe. But the lessons of these nameless heroes of the Middle Ages remain relevant. They teach us to appreciate warmth, light, and safety, and remind us of the incredible ability of the human spirit to adapt and survive in the harshest conditions. Please suggest topics for future videos that you would like to see on our channel in the comments. What other secrets of the past should we uncover together? And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss out on new journeys into history.
What other historical mysteries do you want